Welcome back to the Dive Line with Jim and Craig. Today we've got Samantha Howlett with us, and she's going to be talking to us about her research and her work with coral reefs and climate impacts on the coral reefs and French Polynesia, among many other places. So welcome, Samantha. Hello.
Hi, Jim.
Hi, Samantha. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm good.
Thank you for coming in and joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Really interesting subject that we're going to be talking about. Just before we get into that, though, would you like to just tell everyone a little bit about yourself and how you got into diving, really?
Yeah, sure. I've sort of had a bit of a higgledy-piggledy crazy journey with my career. I first got into diving back in 2007. So after school, I was working as a veterinary nurse or training to be a veterinary nurse and living in a small hometown village. And I thought, I really want to get out there and see the world. So my first diving foray was I went out to the Caribbean on a volunteer project for 3 months. That was with Coral Cay Conservation. Never been diving before, but signed up a couple of grand's worth of money and decided to go out there knowing I would love it. And yeah, I was out there for 3 months, I think, and did all the way out to rescue diver. And yeah, learned how to do some marine surveys, did a lot of species ID, and just had a fantastic time. And thought, you know what, I just got the bug and I wanted to do as much diving as I could. And I've always been motivated by protecting nature and our wild spaces. So went to university to do my undergraduate in animal biology and conservation. And yeah, while I was studying, did my dive master out in Cyprus, which is how I met Marcus, our friend.
Our mutual friend, Marcus.
Yeah.
Hello, Marcus.
Hi, Marcus. Yeah, my mentor from those days. So yeah, did a season out there, and yeah, long crazy road from there. Worked on a few different terrestrial projects because I'm more of a general ecologist. I call myself an accidental marine biologist because I'm not really sure how I ended up in this field, but I'm very grateful that I did. But no, I've worked on pronghorn migration in North America. I tracked caracal in Namibia and done a few different marine projects as well. So worked out in Kuwait. I did a project there, worked out in Ecuador on a marine project. So yeah, and then before the PhD that I'm doing now, I was working in Latvia and we were looking at human-wildlife conflicts. So we were looking at how deer impact forestry, so whether they overgraze forest stands and the economic impact they have, and yeah, looking at human wildlife conflict with large carnivores, so they have wolves and lynx and stuff. So we were doing monitoring of these species, and then I came back into doing marine stuff for the PhD.
Oh, so you didn't actually set out to leave school and go to university and do all this PhD or degrees and diving and go, right, this is going to be my job. You fell into it. Yeah,
so it's absolutely hysterical. So when I was younger and I was thinking of going to university, I always wanted to be a vet. And everyone said it's a really long time to become qualified, you have to study for. And 10 years later, I'm still a student. And I think I didn't really think through the process back then. I was just motivated by what I was passionate about. And I'm very grateful. I've had some really awesome experiences and been to lots of really cool places. But yeah, a 33-year-old student living in a shared house with 6 people still. So definitely some...
At least you're not living at home with your parents still.
I am right now for lockdown. But yeah, it was good to be here and have the family rather than be up there by myself. So
yeah, it's quite amazing though that there are lots of people that set out on try and achieve a course that you've sort of followed, where their aim is to be a marine biologist and started out doing all of that study and the diving just to go down that avenue, and you sort of almost fell into place for you, Samantha.
It really did, and I think the reason that it happened for me is because I built up different skill sets that actually worked out being quite valuable. So I became a dive master quite early on. So from 2007, when I started diving, I think it was only a couple of years later that I was up to doing dive master level. And from the volunteering, I had done marine surveys and I knew general species ID. So even though you go to different places in the world, I could identify, well, that's a grouper, that's a rabbitfish, that's a parrotfish, and I knew all these different skills. So so it was just really handy. And I actually got one of my jobs in university just from talking to a fellow student in the class. And she was a year ahead of me. She was in her final year, a really good young researcher. She did her work on sea turtle identification, and they had this project coming up, and we were doing a marine biology class. I can't remember what this specific topic was on, but she knew all these different fish and she knew so much about it. And I just said, how do you know all this? And she said, oh, well, I've worked out in Akumal in Mexico, and she'd been on these projects. And so I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I told her about what I did. And then she said, oh, well, we need people that can do surveys for this project we've got coming up. And so I ended up getting that job. And I think I've just been really, really lucky. I've built my skill set, and a lot of things have fallen into place for me as well. So yeah.
That sounds amazing, that does, doesn't it? It's just by chance you were talking to this person and it's just gone on from there. That started the whole sort of snowball of what you're up to now.
Yeah, it's all about building contacts. So I've always had really good relationships with people I've worked with, and they know people who know other people. And so yeah, once you kind of get on that first step, it's easier to get then more work and get your foot in the door, so to speak.
What was your first real job, as a first one that you took after you qualified and you're sort of going into your research and ecology? What was the first job?
So as like a full-time paid position. So I did all these seasonal positions as a field technician, which is basically a lackey who does all the hard work. And my first full-time job was the science coordinator for Global Vision International in Seychelles and Mahe. So my job was to train all this volunteers that came out to, I was now, from where I was with Coral K, I was now the person training all the volunteers, teaching them to do the surveys, writing all the reports and analysing the data. And then for GVI, they have a lot of in-country project partners. So they work with Seychelles National Parks Authority, Seychelles Fishing Authority. And so I then had to write reports for what we were doing to go to our project partners as well.
So where have you been working most recently, Samantha? Where have you just come back from?
I've just finished my third and final expedition out to Moorea in French Polynesia in the Pacific. Sadly, that was my final trip. So I collected all the data for my PhD, and now I've got a year to analyze everything, write everything up, and hopefully find some really interesting trends that will make a contribution to our scientific knowledge on how climate change is affecting coral reef ecosystems.
Is the South Pacific as beautiful as everyone says it is? The images you see of Tahiti and you know, those sort of places, is it the White Golden Sounds tropical paradise?
It really is. So for all the places that I've been diving in tropical locations, French Polynesia for me was probably the closest that I've experienced to a healthy reef. So a lot of places in the world you dive, they have a lot of localized impacts. So where we were in the Caribbean, the Coral K project was biodiversity mapping. And basically a lot of areas there, the reefs are really affected by sediment runoff, agricultural runoff. So that's not even just sediment, it's also like fertilizers and things. There's like developments for hotels. So there's a lot of real localized impacts, which means that the diversity in the coral just isn't there in the same way. Seychelles was really beautiful, but they have a history of having a local artisanal shark fishery, which has quite a big impact on the ecosystem. And as we're starting to understand now, you need these top level predators to regulate lower levels in the trophic level in the ecosystem. So French Polynesia being somewhere where they've had, it's been a shark sanctuary now for over 10 years, you've got the regeneration of these top level predators. So you have the benefits of the knock-on levels through the ecosystem of that. And yeah, just really diverse coral communities. And yeah, it was just absolutely fantastic.
So there isn't just climate impacts, like you say, there's local impacts. So the coral, wherever it is in the world, is getting like battered all over the place, isn't it? And so you went to the Seychelles. Have you been back there several years later and seen the actual impact of all the issues that have gone on from local to climate? You know, there must have been a nice big healthy reef, and then go back several years later and it's not so healthy.
Unfortunately, I haven't seen it myself with my own eyes, but I have definitely seen it change. So when I was out there in 2012, so in 2008, they had, sorry, in 1990, I'm mixing up. 1998 was the first worldwide sort of mass bleaching event that we'd seen. So multiple locations in the tropics having these mass die-offs of coral through to these elevated sea surface temperatures. And that event in 1998 was to do with an El Nino event. And so after that happened, there wasn't any more sort of like large scale impacts. And so the coral had a chance to recover. So in 2012, when I was there, in areas there was 100% coral cover, the diversity was incredible. You had all different types. It was a joy to train the students whenever I went out, and we had a checklist of all the different species. You were pretty much guaranteed, even if you went to different sites, to see every single type of coral. And very sadly, the way that climate change is working is that the impacts are getting more severe and more often. And so in 2016 and 2017, that was 2 years back to back, they had the same level of bleaching, and the coral has just been decimated again. So a lot of my friends that work out there have sent me photographs, and areas in our local bay where I used to train all the volunteers, you just can't recognize it anymore. All of the really big colonies of these branching corals that are really important for like fish and crabs and other species are just completely gone, and it just looks completely different.
That's really sad, isn't it? I mean, is there any way back for it?
There is, we hope. So the big, you were saying that we have local stresses, and what we also have is global impacts. So the really big elephant in the room that we need to address is climate change, because as much as we can address coastal development and we can address land use, we can address fishing, all of these things will improve the resilience of the reef. But the coral itself and the diverse coral communities won't survive in the future that we're seeing of these increased bleaching events. So we had 2016 and 2017 bleaching in Seychelles. They've recently had another bleaching event. French Polynesia, which so CREOB, that I was the organized research base out there, which I did my work through. They've been monitoring the reefs out French Polynesia since the 70s or something. It's really, really cool data set that they have that I've been analyzing. And last year in 2019 is some of the worst bleaching they've seen. They haven't really experienced mass die-offs through coral bleaching. And in the reefs where I was working, more than 50% of the coral was died, and it's just really staggering just to see that these big impacts are just getting worse. And so it really is important for us to talk more about climate change and really do what we can to engage with that.
So do you feel like, being at the sharp end and being so close and seeing that change, do you feel like it's a losing battle? That you know, is it too late? You know, or can we still, change the climate enough that the reefs will recover?
I don't want to think it's a losing battle. I definitely see it as a very big challenge. And I think some people see that it's so big that they just can't engage with it. But I don't think that's true at all. So even just with the recent COVID-19, where human activity and like our production, our use of cars, planes, all that sort of thing, only for a few months has been limited, and we've already seen the impact that can have. And I hope that can give us, it can inspire us to see that small changes can actually add up.
That was the other thing I was going to mention, really, was obviously you've seen the negative impact, but you must have seen the positive impact as well. I mean, although there's 50% gone in Polynesia, you said, or 50% plus, there is ways that it can rejuvenate, and you must have seen the positive impacts as well of humans being able to rejuvenate it.
Absolutely, for sure. So these big disturbance events aren't new. Corals can recover. The problem is the time. In 2010 was the last sort of big disturbance event that Moorea saw on their reefs, and what they had was they had 2 years where they had crown of thorns, these sea stars that come in and eat all of they predate on the coral. So 2 years of that where the reefs were being attacked by these sea stars, and then after that they had a cyclone come in 2010, and so I mean the reef was just less than 3% coral cover, so really decimated in this event, and coral cover returned within 10 years. So when I was there, the first trip, most places, especially on the northern reef, were 100% coral cover. We are seeing a change in composition of coral types. So Pacillopora as a branching coral is quite fast growing. We're starting to see a lot more of that. It could be that it's just a fast growing coral that's able to use the space more. We're seeing more coral cover of corals that are a little bit more heat resilient. So these big boulder corals, which are typically like Parrotfish, they don't die from heat stress more. So we're seeing more of those species. So the composition is changing a little bit, but they are resilient and they can recover. We just need to give them the time.
So how did your research help with these impacts?
So a lot of what I'm doing is trying to understand when we have these big disturbance events, how that physically changes the environment. So the old school of thought in ecology and conservation was biodiversity theory. If you have more species, then the reef is going to be more healthy, or any ecosystem typically will be more healthy. But now we're trying to say, okay, well, why is that? And what is a healthy ecosystem? And so now what we're trying to do is understand how an ecosystem functions. So when you have a community of species, how they relate to each other, and what processes are necessary for reefs to recover. And so one of the things that I focused in on is the interaction between herbivorous reef fish. So these are the ones that eat the algae and they graze on the coral reef. And the reason I chose them is because they're a really important mechanism for reef recovery. And so when you have a big bleaching event, the corals die and they become overgrown with algae. And what you need is that, like, first line of defense, I guess you could say, is these herbivores come in and they'll eat the algae and they'll keep it down to allow the coral to recover. So if the algae isn't kept in check, then it proliferates and it's much harder for the coral to come back. So we know that following these events, we see more herbivores, but I'm trying to understand, well, what are the physical changes to habitat that drives like their feeding behavior? So the algae that grows, is it more nutritious for certain types of species? And is the algae more productive? And then when we see the changes in the community, I'm trying to estimate, well, okay, we know what the community of the fish is, and we know that them grazing is important for the ecosystem. So I'm trying to model, given a community of fish for the species and size, what the actual strength of the ecosystem processes are, so what the strength of grazing is. And so what I'm doing with the long-term data is I'm trying to explore, well, as these communities changing, is it still functioning in the same way? So what we're actually seeing is changes in the fish community. So there's less herbivores in general, which could be due to overfishing. And what that means is the grazing potential of the reef is decreasing. So what we need to do is need to have a look at fishing pressure. Maybe we need to readdress how the marine protected areas are allocated, because I know that that's actually something that's going to be happening at some point in Moorea soon, because a lot of the MPAs are very small. And so MPAs can only be effective if they're a certain size, because fish move. And so if you don't have that area that can be a refuge, then they just won't work in the same way. So yeah, I'm looking at all these different things, and it's more trying to understand like the function of recovery and how this process happens.
Am I right in thinking that parrotfish play a big role in this, and their grazing? I mean, they're often overlooked. They're ever so colourful and I think pretty looking fish, but I seem to remember something about parrotfish being rather important, and you following some individual fish around.
Yeah, so part of me building this model of how the community functions is to understand how much grazing pressure that these fish have. And parrotfish are really important because if anyone who's been diving on a tropical coral reef has seen them, they're really beautiful. Some of them can get quite big. And they're called parrotfish because they have these really strong beak-like jaws. And so the way that they feed is they rasp away at the substrate. And what that means is through the act of feeding, they're really clearing anything off that's growing there. And corals need quite a clear substrate for them to establish. So parrotfish are really important. But as a fish gets bigger, its jaws get sort of exponentially stronger and they scrape and erode more. So part of my work was I had to follow fish. It's a lot harder than you would imagine. And I had to, first of all, try and count how many bites they took per minute. And then I had to measure their bite sizes and to the size of the fish so that I could put all this data into my model and say, okay, so for a community of big fish, they scrape a lot more because a bigger fish has more of an impact than even if you have the same like amount of fish, but they're all smaller. So, yeah.
So just for you sort of slightly touched on it there, but for the uninitiated, just tell us a little bit about the day-to-day work. I mean, how many dives a day? Are you using video and photo? Are you just got a slate to take notes on? How does it actually, how do you do your work?
So I took a kind of like the best way to be successful in science, and especially ecology, when you work with wild animals, you can't predict their behavior and they're very elusive. So I took a very diverse approach. So I did cameras and I did filming. I built these stereo frames. So basically, if you have two cameras, it kind of works like your eyes and you get depth perception. So these two cameras on a frame, I put them out on the reef and you can measure distances and you can measure the size of the fish. So I had them out filming and on these areas of the reef, and I could count how often they were feeding and things like that. But then because I have all this data that Creobe already had, then I also went out and followed the fish and took that approach. So, because when you film, you can only see what comes in and out of the camera. Whereas if you follow a fish, you can see how it moves around the reef. You can see where it chooses to feed. You can see how far it moves and things. So you just get a lot more data. So I had to do some sunrise surveys because you have to capture the activity of the fish at the start of the day. So I had a few days where we went out in the boat as soon as we possibly could when it was light, and we did some sunrise surveys. And then you compare that to the middle of the day, so like peak activity, and then you can model how that changes throughout the day. So I did a lot of dives, yeah.
And were you out there a long time then?
So I did 3 trips. The first trip I did was a month, but then I did 2 trips of 7 months. So 6 and 7 months, yeah. So I also, as another part of my work, I did an experiment. So ironically, I designed this experiment to look at how coral bleaching influences how the algae grows. So I set up these aquarium and I worked with people so that we could program the aquarium to be at certain temperatures. So I could see at what temperature the coral dies, how long it is at that temperature before the coral dies. So I did that. And then after the coral died, I put it out on the reef and then later on sampled. And that takes a long time. So I went out there, set that up, then did all the behavioral stuff. And then after a few months, went back and did that.
What depths were your dives at?
Mostly around 12 meters. So when you dive on a coral reef, like a lot of places where you go, people will say you can snorkel. So you can, corals need to be where they have a lot of light. They don't want to be too shallow because it gets too warm. But yeah, typically around 10 meters is a really, really good spot for corals. As you get deeper, then light doesn't penetrate as effectively. And corals need light because they have symbiotic algae that photosynthesizes, and that's how they get their energy. So yeah, most of my dives are around 10 meters.
You mentioned wildlife just a moment ago. I hear a rumour that there's less wildlife now in French Polynesia. Is this true?
There is, yeah. After my final trip recently, I brought a little waif and stray home with me. So they have quite a big problem, and it's with lots of these island nations with stray cats and dogs. And yeah, my last trip, as soon as I arrived, this little dog turned up and she just wouldn't leave for the whole time I was there. And obviously after 6 months, you get really attached to an animal. And yeah, so I brought a little dog home with me. Her name is Pasta.
Couldn't leave her behind.
No. And
how fabulous. And what a fantastic memento of that whole trip to have a dog with you for however many years you have that now. That's lovely.
Yeah, but it was hilarious. She's such a motivated creature. So from the point where she decided that she wanted to stay with me, she would follow me everywhere. She'd sit in front of the lab if I was there for hours. And she even swam after our dive boat one day out to sea.
She was determined.
Really determined.
Sounds like this could be a movie.
You've earned this. I'm going to bring you back.
So yeah, it sounds like it could be a Disney movie in the making there.
Well, considering what do I make, like 14 grand a year without tax? Maybe I'll write to Disney and see if I can make a fortune.
Yeah, there could be some movie rights there. Could make you very wealthy.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's an amazing story, isn't it? And like you say, it's a lovely memento, if you like, and something you'll forever remember. Just going back to the reefs, reefs, although they've got all these impacts, whether it's local or global or environmental, are they quite resilient then, or is it just, is that it? They've gone and they're never coming back?
Not at all. So if you look at the fossil record, corals have been through periods of intense climate change before. So this isn't the first time, but it just, whenever you have these events, and so now we say we're in the Anthropocene, so literally the impact that people are having on the environment is shaping what our geological era is going to look back. So imagine in, I don't know, thousands of years time, people look in the fossil record, humans will have a direct impact of that. So moving on from where we are now, coral reefs probably will change. The species composition will change. It's done that before. It doesn't mean that they can't recover. But we don't know what it means for the future. And the problem is so the project that I'm working on is called Reef Services. And so that's funding from France. And the idea is through the work that we do collaboratorily, is that a word? So there's PhD students and postdoc researchers. And what we're trying to answer is, in the future, in the face of climate change, how is that going to impact people that rely on the reefs? So people rely on the reefs for coastal protection, they rely on the reefs for food and nutrition and tourism. So our work is hopefully going to tie in to answer some of those questions.
Where French Polynesia is located, for those that don't know, it's the middle of the South Pacific. It's not quite halfway from Australia to South America. Effectively, it's in the middle of nowhere as far as big communities are concerned. Do you see much plastic waste there that's not from the islands, that has travelled into the islands from tides?
Not in French Polynesia, actually, but that's a really interesting question. So it all depends on ocean currents as well. In French Polynesia, that's not an issue, but in the Seychelles it is. So we used to do regular beach cleans on Mahe with the volunteers, simply because the way that currents move, we would see a lot of plastic waste brought in. And the saddest story of all is there's a Aldabra atoll there as well. I'm not sure what level of designation it is. I think it's one of the highest ones. So they don't have any invasive rats. They've still got all the bird nesting communities, and it's still kind of pristine for the area. But a friend of mine who works there had to organize the Aldabra cleanup project, because even though there's no people there and there's no people that live even remotely near there, the way that ocean currents move is all of our stuff gets dumped there. So they regularly have to go and do boat trips to remove it. Tons.
That's incredible, isn't it? That's incredible.
Yeah.
And it must be, to be in that sort of location and have to do that, I would find that quite soul destroying, that you know, the beautiful places, as you just described, suffer like that because of, you know, what humans do with their rubbish and the plastics that we use and the wasteful societies that we live in. And unlike us divers, people just don't love their oceans.
No.
I think a lot of people just aren't aware. And I'd had to smile to myself then, because I realized that a lot of what I'm saying comes across very negative. And it's not the most cheerful conversation, but the reality is we are a lot more aware of our impact on the environment now than we ever have been. And we've had, you know, some really key moments that might not seem like much, but hopefully instigating real change. Blue Planet 2 effect, or David Attenborough effect, they called it, when they started showing our impact of plastic waste. And already governments started implementing, you know, taking things seriously and implementing change and saying this is something we need to address. So it is horrible to see that with your own eyes, but it is also great to feel like hopefully I can contribute in some way.
Yeah, I think we are the first generation to know that we're causing so much damage rather than making it better.
Yeah, that's really true, Jim. I think the next generation are just not going to stand for it. You know, I think that's the comfort factor, so to speak, in that, as you just said, Samantha, we're much more aware, but our kids, as they're growing up now, are more aware than we are by a long shot, and won't stand for what we've done previously, and so that's encouraging.
No, it is, and we definitely there's been a lot of big changes, and even just a lot of these ecosystems can recover quite quickly. So in French Polynesia, they instigated it as a shark sanctuary in like the early 2000s, and prior to that, shark finning, fishing and finning did occur there, and shark populations were really low. But I mean, when I was diving there, I would see a shark on every single dive. They're just everywhere, and it's great to see their populations to start to recover, even within just quite a short window, really. So these ecosystems are more resilient than we think. We just need to give them a chance, and I think we're starting to do that now.
I think we've got a video, haven't we? You sent us a video of your dive with the sharks, and there's hundreds of them everywhere.
Yeah, it was absolutely incredible. We actually went to a specific location, and it's called the White Valley. So between Moorea and Tahiti, there's this big channel, and sharks tend to congregate where you have like quite a lot of water movement. They tend to rest there during the day. So we went there, and it was just absolutely insane. You know, we just went down, and there they were, just cruising up and down. We just sat there for like 40 minutes, just being like, oh my God, like sharks everywhere. And I think there's in the video, one of my friends is just sort of like shaking his head or pointing at them like in disbelief.
What species do you tend to get most of there?
So predominantly we would see a lot of black-tip reef sharks, sicklefin lemon sharks we would see a lot of as well, and grey reef sharks. We saw some nurse sharks, white-tip reef sharks. One of the reasons people go to the White Valley is it's a really good place to encounter tiger sharks. We didn't see one, but I mean, we saw huge lemon sharks and just, yeah, more grey reefs than I could count. So yeah, it was awesome.
I just said that's so on my bucket list to be in that water with a camera.
Yeah, I feel very grateful to be able to have these experiences for sure.
So is it still like that now then? Is that reef still completely intact and still got those hundreds of sharks, thousands of sharks that you have?
I hope so. So one of the things that we're trying to answer now is how these bottom-up changes to the habitat, so the loss of coral and the change of the benthic community, how does that impact up through the food chain? So, you know, it's easier to draw connections like I'm doing with how those changes relate to herbivores because they interact with it more. But then, you know, modeling that through, well, how does changes to herbivores affect prey availability for sharks? So these are all questions that people are trying to look at now. So it's hard to say in what time frame and what scale that impact will be. But hopefully they are still there.
I mean, it does all sound a bit negative, but I don't think I think it's a message that needs to be told and shouted every time somebody's doing. We need to just keep saying, look, everything that humans have done is impacting on our planet, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the one thing that we should do is listen to science. So let me see how I can say this politically. There's, you know, some climate change deniers and distrust, I think, in the scientific community for some reason, which is just ridiculous. So, you know, we should really listen to the science and do what we can and what we know is the best option at the time. So small changes I'm trying to make for myself is I'm trying to eat less meat because we know that eating meat, especially beef, has a really big impact on the environment, and it does impact our carbon footprint. So that's a change that I can make. I'm trying to use my car less. I'm trying to cycle to work, and trying to eat locally. So all these different things, we can make small changes. And I'm sure my friends get sick of me talking, but I try and encourage other people to do that too. And then collectively, these will add up to big impacts.
To be honest, I think it's becoming more and more prevalent. I'm doing exactly the same. I eat very little meat now, and all of those. I don't eat seafood. So yeah, there's and I think that is a growing movement. Let's say that people are wanting to make change, aren't they?
Yeah, which is really encouraging. Yeah.
So you mentioned Samantha, that you're coming to the end of the work that you've been doing. What's next for you?
That's a really big question. So the academic world is very competitive. So after the PhD, I could get a job as a postdoctoral researcher. So my first sort of official research position, but it's very competitive. So I'm going to look for that, but I'm also keeping my options open to maybe get more of a government job, so like for Natural England, or work for an NGO, maybe like WWF or something. Fortunately, because I've done such a diverse career, and I've worked in lots of different habitats for different species, I'm hoping that will benefit me and I can adapt again. I might not be working in coral reefs, but as long as I can do something to be protecting nature and wild spaces, then I would be very happy.
Yeah, it must be a very impressive CV when you read through everything that you've done now.
Yeah, gosh, more than 10 years I've been doing different projects. So yeah.
So Samantha, you've worked for some really interesting organisations. Do you want to just finish off with spending a couple of minutes telling us about each of those?
Yeah, so I've been really lucky. The PhD project that I work on is a collaboratory effort. So I'm enrolled at Lancaster University, and I'm there on their Reefs team. And so that's like the name of our lab. It's like, what is it? Reefs is reef environments, ecosystem functioning, and society. It's we had to come up with a lab name, and we all sort of had a vote on what to call it. And it's quite a long title, but it's because it's a very diverse group of people. So so the lab is a fairly new one. It's been around for a couple of years, and the PhD students work on all different topics. So you have people looking at how financing conservation is changing, how the way that people view services with the ecosystems, how people get nutrition from reefs, all these different topics, how all that's changing in the future and how we can protect it. So that's where I'm based. That's the university and the lab that I work out of. So then the project that I'm funded through is called Reef Services, and this is actually based in France. So the University EPHE, that's a French name. I won't pronounce all of it because I don't speak French very well and it will sound awful. Yeah, so that is a group of PhD students and postdocs that got funding to go and tackle different aspects of how the way reefs will change in the future and what that means for the people that depend on them. And then the final organization that I was working through is called CREOBE. So CREOBE is out in Moorea, and I think I mentioned earlier that they've been out there for a really long time. The organization has grown a lot over the years. So when I was there, we saw photographs of this little shack that was on the beach, and all the little bunk bed areas where people used to sleep, and now it's a full research base with like proper aquariums and labs, genetics like areas for like -80 freezers. They got loads of really cool toys that scientists like to play with. So it's a really great vibrant research base now. So I was really lucky to work there. And they have a French department as well, which is based in Perpignan. So I worked with a lot of French students and researchers when I was out there.
Is CREOBE, I mean, the facilities sound fantastic. Is that government funded or part government, part private, or just private funded?
So I think CREOBE do get money through French government, but a lot of the work that happens there comes through applying for grants. So the Institute is driven a lot by having good researchers that prove to do really good research, and so continuously get funding from independent sources as well.
Finished on a positive note.
Yeah. I don't know, I try.
Fantastic, fascinating. We could talk for hours. I mean, yeah. Some of the things that you've done and the things that you've achieved, and thank God at some stage lockdown will be finished and we'll be able to meet up and sit in a bar with a bottle of Corona and talk about everything you've done.
Yeah, no, I really look forward to that, and I can do my first ever dry suit dive. Yeah. And that would be a great new challenge.
Well, I mean, we'd be happy to have you back again as well. And like Craig said, we've got so much we can chat about, and there's endless questions that we've got. We just can't fit it all in. It's just trying to push it all into sort of 45 minutes. It's just not long enough.
No, I know, and I think I get carried away chatting as well. So, yeah, I could talk for hours if you'd let me.
We would, yeah. I mean, more episodes coming. Stay tuned.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming in. It's very much appreciated. It's been really, really interesting talking to you. We look forward to doing it again.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely great. Thank you, guys.
Yes, thank you.
And I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you.
Bye for now.